Good afternoon once again, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Taking Risks to Restore Reefs, Community Seeding with Arms in Madagascar. Our speaker today is Dr. Erin Hartmann, who is one of the senior scientists here at the Perry Institute for Marine Science. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and a friendly reminder to keep your microphone muted during the session. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session. So please add any questions that you may have into the Q&A section or into the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end during the Q&A session. And as well, an audience feedback survey link will be shared in the chat, and we would really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. So without further ado, I will now welcome Dr. Hartmann to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you everyone for being here today. So this project we've been working on for about 5 years now, called Arms Restore, and we'll kind of dig into what that means exactly. But oftentimes people keep their acknowledgments to the end, but I'm going to put it first and foremost that this is a project encompassing about 60 or 70 people from 7 or 8 different countries at all of these organizations you see here in the bottom left, and supported by all of the funders and more, in fact, that you see here in the middle. So what I'm going to be talking about truly is a large group effort. So coral reefs, like this one, are arguably the most biodiverse ecosystem on the planet. That is, they have the most number of species living on them. That makes them extremely valuable to people for food, for livelihoods. They build these hard structures that protect shorelines, and they're even the source of molecules that we turn into medicines to fight things like Ebola, HIV, AIDS, and as well, most recently, COVID-19. You may have heard that coral reefs are on the decline, and that is certainly true, but that makes me particularly excited to show you here these photos. I took this photo while snorkeling about a year ago. And I took this photo in Southwest Madagascar, where there are still thriving reefs. Here are some other pictures of these reefs. These ones in particular have not been touched by bleaching quite so much. Bleaching is the process where, when warmer waters occur, the coral gets stressed and can potentially die. Fortunately, these ones are somewhat resilient to bleaching. They're also very good at regenerating, so they can reproduce and create new ones. And that makes these what I think of as sort of some of the toughest reefs around. Here's one more example. We call this one Rose Garden for obvious reasons. And these are just truly some of the most incredible reefs left in the world. But when you look at these reefs, you see all these beautiful corals, but you probably see something that's missing. What do you think is missing? You can use the chat to say it. I teach a lot, and so it's hard for me to pull out of teacher mode. So I will be asking you questions, and I do encourage you to use the chat. But I will answer it here for you, and that answer is fish, right? So you don't really see much life beyond the corals. The fish appear to be missing. And because those fish are missing, and because of a number of other things, there are reefs very nearby to the reefs I just showed you that are really no longer reefs. They're dead reefs. This is one such dead reef here. We can tell from what we can see under the brown and under the sediment that there once was a reef there. We can see a few corals here in the bottom hanging on, but really this tells us that a reef was here and that it died. And as I mentioned, one of the big reasons for that has to do with the lack of fish. And when we think about the role of fish, and you kind of, maybe you know, maybe you don't, as to why fish matter for a coral reef, is fish, and in particular herbivorous fishes, so things that eat essentially plants, are really important. The analogy I like to think of is if you are, say, trying to grow a slow-growing ornamental tree in your yard, you continuously need to mow the lawn around it because you don't want your grass to grow quickly and grow over this slow-growing tree that you have. Same is true in the coral reef. If there are not herbivores around to eat away at algae, which is essentially like grass, turf algae, um, it will overtake the corals. And so when you overfish herbivores, you've effectively removed your lawnmower, and now you've made it much, much harder for corals to thrive. And so, of course, one of the big reasons for the lack of fish in the system, as you may have guessed, has to do with fishing, and in particular, overfishing. So, if people in the system fish with boats, they also fish on foot. And the reason that that has gotten worse in recent years isn't because individuals are greedy. It's not because their individuals are taking too much, but it's actually because more and more people are moving to the coast. And they're moving there in search of food and livelihoods. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's the case. Um, but all this is to say, I think it's important to note that while overfishing is one of the major causes of reef decline, the people who are doing it are not the ones to be blamed because they are the people with the least amount of power and the least amount of resources. And really, as I'll show you later, people living really on sort of the margins of malnutrition and starvation in these systems. And so, hand in hand with overfishing and the loss of fish and herbivores, we also see decline in these systems as a result of things like sedimentation. So, when we cut down trees, it can be hundreds of miles from the coast. That can destabilize ground and lead to sediments and other things running down a river and all the way into the bay, which can then smother corals. And we also see a lot of nutrients coming in from rivers or just from runoff. You can sort of think of this as pollution, and that too can kill off the corals and stifle these reefs. So when we think about the lack or the loss of reefs and what that means, I think these images really kind of take it home on the humanist side of things, which is that these families that we're seeing here are living right on the margin, right? And so these are the people who are most impacted by the loss of reefs, and by the fact that the overall fishery is being depleted. And so when I think about coral reef restoration, I don't just think about bringing back the corals. I don't just think about sort of bringing back the biodiversity, but I think about also bringing back sort of the sustenance and meeting the needs of the people who most depend on these reefs and who have historically, for thousands of years, been dependent on these reefs. And so I've hinted at it, but just to put some numbers, at the national level, I think most people, when they think of Madagascar, they probably think of perhaps the baobab trees we see here. They almost certainly think of lemurs. They might think of a popular movie. But while Madagascar is an incredible country biologically, and its humans are incredible people and resilient people, it is one of the most impoverished countries in the world. So in the Global Health Index, it's 124th out of 125 countries, which puts it at an alarming hunger level. Globally, it has some of the highest levels of childhood stunting, which is a sign of chronic malnutrition. That is when a child is not as tall as they should be for their age, due to chronic malnutrition. And the country has some of the highest maternal mortality rates of any country in the world. And where we're looking at, so where we're thinking about in the Southwest, where the coral reefs are, um, we found that over 91% of people there are living in poverty, and that's relative to the national average of 76%, which of course is already quite high, but that's all to say it's even worse in the Southwest. Part of the reason why it's worse is that a persistent drought that has recently been linked to climate change on the country's interior in the South has caused people to migrate to the coast. And the UN in the last couple of years dubbed this as the first climate-induced famine. And so it really goes to show sort of how environmental change and climate change impacts human migration, which then impacts the reef ecosystems, what they're able to provide, and to human poverty and malnutrition. Okay, so specifically, all of the images I showed you earlier are from this one bay. So it's called the Bay of Ranobe or Big Water, and it is located in southwest Madagascar. It, as you saw, is home to coral reef ecosystems. This area of Madagascar has the largest amount of coral reefs in the country. The bay is also what I would call kind of a national fishing hub. So there's a lot of fishing activity there, as I mentioned before. It's a really interesting system. It's semi-enclosed, so it has a barrier reef around it, and it's massive. The coastline is about 27 kilometers, and there are two passes. And so what a pass is it's essentially just a gap in the barrier reef that lets water in and out between the bay and the Mozambique Channel, which is kind of the stretch that you see here between Madagascar and mainland Africa to the west. And as I've also mentioned in the Bay, really we kind of characterize it as an area with recent loss of coral reef ecosystems, significant decline in fisheries, and as a result of that, increasing malnutrition. And so the communities of the Bay, there are 13 of them, are certainly quite aware of the food crisis. How could they not be? They live it every single day. And so they chose, starting about 12 years ago now, they actually sort of sat down, had meetings, and decided how to address the food crisis. And so what they chose to do was to build small artificial reefs. So artificial reefs are human-made structures that create foundations for new reefs to grow on naturally. So why do you think that you would do this to address the food crisis? So to answer that, it's
Sorry,
really
Erin. I don't know if you can see the chat, but people are answering. It attracts more fish. It aggregates fish.
yep. I
Yeah.
see that now. I closed it at the wrong time.
Okay.
Indeed, indeed, it is habitat, right? So the fish don't necessarily want to live on a sand flat, but they do want to live on a rocky reef or a coral reef. And so the idea is if you make more habitat, you can then grow more fish. And so that's indeed what they did. You can see it in the bottom left. In collaboration with Reef Doctor, an NGO in the area, they built artificial reefs on which to grow corals. And what they found is that indeed they could get a reef to start to grow, but it was much too small to really make an impact and really increase the amount of fish. And it also grew a bit too slowly to be able to make enough fish for people to eat. And so they realized that they kind of needed to be able to go bigger with this. And I just want to sort of pause for a second because I'll circle back to this at the end. But remember this decision point, and we'll talk about why this decision that they made is so significant at the end. Okay, so I mentioned that these small artificial reefs they made grew some life, didn't form a reef, wasn't large enough really to grow a lot of fish. So it sort of gets you to step back and say, okay, well, what would get you there? You know, what ingredients are needed to build a functional reef? Obviously, making them big is somewhat obvious, but that's not really an ingredient. That's just a scale thing. So when we think about the actual ingredients that you need, we need a complete food web. And so what I mean from that, you know, when you think of food web, you may think of a variety of different things, but what I want you to think about is a complete food web means it's a self-sustaining thing, meaning there is primary productivity, plants, things like that that use the sun's energy to grow at the bottom, and then there are things that eat them, things that eat them, things that eat them, all the way up. Basically, you don't need anything to come in from elsewhere and you can grow things at the bottom and then you can grow up and grow things at the top. And why that's significant and why that matters is that if you just purely aggregate fish to an artificial reef and then fish it, you can actually amplify overharvesting, right? So you bring more fish together, you fish them off, now they're gone. You haven't created more fish, you've just taken more fish efficiently. And so really the idea here and why we want to do the food web and create this whole food web is so that we aren't doing that, so that we're actually creating more fish and growing more fish. Okay, and so another thing that we don't see very often, fortunately, we do see it in the Bahamas, but not very many other places, are these large predators. So large predators are important because it's a sign that we have really big things that are taking up all of that food in the food web. And that means that it's not being stored, say, in algae that are overgrowing corals or being stored in bacteria that live in the water column. It really tells us that we have a healthy reef. And then back to my lawnmower story from the beginning, we really want to see that corals are dominating over algae, right? That algae are not overgrowing corals, but instead the corals are growing up. You don't see many algae, you see a healthy reef. Um, and then lastly, I won't get into what this process is, but we even think about the health of a coral reef down to the level of viruses and bacteria and other microbes. And in fact, viruses are good on coral reefs. We need a large number of viruses, and particularly viruses called phage that prey on bacteria, but that don't prey on corals and other things. Okay, so we sort of had this ingredients list, and we knew we wanted to try to make larger coral reefs. But then we had to think about, okay, how can we meet these ingredients by when we're sort of faced with a sand flat area that we want to build a new reef onto using sort of lifeless structures. And so to answer this question, I have to go back to a tool that we used when I was doing what's called a postdoc. So something I did after my graduate degree. And so what we're doing is using these things that you see in the upper left. So these are stacks of PVC plates. They have space between them. They're anchored together, and we call them autonomous reef monitoring structures. And we go out and place them in a bunch of locations at the same time, let things passively grow on them from around. So in this case, we're putting them out on coral reefs. And then we go and collect them and bring them back. We can take pictures like you see in the bottom left. We also can actually and do literally use paint scrapers to scrape everything off, put it in a blender, sample that delicious smoothie, and put it through a gene sequencing machine. And then that gene sequencing machine can really precisely tell us all the species that are there, all the way down to viruses. And so we were doing that because we really wanted to know where certain species lived and why they lived there. And we wanted to do it in this project. We were asking these questions across the coral triangle, which is what you see here in the map on the bottom. And so really this was an important question for thinking about coral reef health, human impacts on coral reefs. But at its core, it was really an academic-based question of where do species live? Why do they live there? How many are there? And this ARMS tool was perfect for doing that. So when I say it's perfect for doing that, what factors of the ARMS tool do you think are advantageous, say, versus going out and cutting out a chunk of the reef, bringing it back, and then breaking it apart to see the number of species there? Why would ARMS do a better job of doing the census for us? Doesn't damage the reef, non-invasive, absolutely. That was a really big piece of it, Sarah. Yep. What else does it do? I've stumped you all. So really the big thing with these arms, in addition to the fact that we don't have to damage the reef, is the fact that they give us, yes, it will tell us what's on introduced material, and it does help us quantify. And to that point of quantifying, it's been a set period of time. We know exactly how long we put it out there. You can watch succession, absolutely, that's a big one. But it's also a set amount of space, right? And so what all of this means is it's a standardized tool. So we can put it out all these different places, leave it, things grow on it, and then we pull it back in and see what's there. And we aren't comparing apples to oranges, which is what we'd be doing if we just chopped up parts of the reef. But in this case, now we're able to compare apples to apples because we put out the same amount of space in for the same amount of time to see what lives there. And really, the big take home was that a lot of stuff grows on these arms. We could get across this whole geography here. We got um, representatives of 80% of known groups of species that live on coral reefs, which I think is almost unbelievable because we aren't getting anything large. But it just goes to show you how much biodiversity there is, how small it is, but also how well the arms did at picking it up. And so we thought after that project, okay, so the arms are really good at collecting all the stuff around them. They collect a lot of different species, so they're really good at that. So why don't we kind of hack that, or why don't we rethink that for use in restoration? And so that led us to come to this community seeding concept, which is we're going to take advantage of the fact that if you put the arms out, they'll passively collect all the biological ingredients you require for a healthy reef. So here we're talking about organisms from corals and sponges and larger things you can see, all the way down to bacteria and viruses. But then we pick them up, and instead of taking them out of the ocean, scraping them with paint scrapers and making smoothies, we actually move them and leave them in the ocean. And so we move them to an artificial reef. And the idea here is we're essentially creating like a seed bomb that you might throw out into your garden. So we're throwing sort of all of the organisms out there to then see whether we can seed this artificial reef as a way to speed up or jumpstart reef formation. And then if we can do that, then we can potentially create that whole trophic system I mentioned and actually grow more fish. Okay, so fast forward to the Arms Restore project. We were able to get funding to try this in the Bay of Ranobe in Madagascar with these goals. And the first thing we did, and the first thing I did, is I priced out what sending PVC from Boston to Madagascar would cost. And it would cost about $17,000 just to ship. And so we already had been a bit wary of the arms, the original arms design. I think for obvious reasons, it's made of plastic and metal. And then that was sort of the kicker that got us to rethink this. And so we completely kind of redesigned and rethought it. We wanted natural materials. We wanted materials we could source locally and that could be sourced local to coral reefs sort of throughout the world. And we wanted something that was relatively cheap. And so this led us and our team there to redesign the arms as you see here. The last piece was to make them into a pyramid. Any guesses as to why we did that? Stability and surface area. Yes, absolutely. And in particular, to that question of surface area, we did it so that we would get more light penetration, so that we go more of a mix of things that like to live in light and things that like to live in dark. You can see the arms, the original arms in the upper left, really good for things that like to live in dark, not so great for things that live in light. And so with the pyramid, you get more of a mix of that. And then, yes, absolutely, it makes them more stable in high water flow environments. And so we made them, our teams put them onto boats, took them out to those healthy reefs that I showed you, found areas where we didn't have corals growing, and then hammered the rebar stakes in as best as we could. We can see the one here on the left that didn't do so well, but then left them to let things passively grow on them. And indeed they did. And so this was after about a year. And what you're seeing here on the right is just sort of a snippet. We had a few test arms that we did bring into the lab and disassembled. And so these are just a bunch of what we call the motile organisms we find living on them. Cool to see even some vertebrates, some larval fish there, and lots of invertebrates. And we also, what was particularly exciting, is got a lot of coral recruitment. So I mentioned before that these reefs are really good at regenerating, at reproducing. And that's a really exciting and unfortunately rare thing on coral reefs these days. But in fact, it works really well here. So this is about a year and a half, 2 years in. And so I imagine that the coral ecologists on this call today probably have pretty wide eyes seeing how much growth we've gotten just in that short period of time. We were completely blown away. And this is sort of my showing off slide because the reefs there just the corals just grow like gangbusters, and this happens naturally. These corals were not planted here; they just found the arms and grew. And so that was super, super exciting to us. And so, like I said, we converted this into, or we were sort of funded to create this experiment. And so the experiment is really testing, does this arm seeding concept work? Does it speed up reef growth? Does it increase more fish? And are we actually creating that full trophic structure, or are we just aggregating the fish together? And so what you're looking at here on the left now is the Bay of Ranobe, zoomed in a bit. And so what we're doing is building 6 reefs, and 3 of them will have arm seating and 3 of them will not. The reef design we chose is called spur and groove, which just is kind of exactly what you see here on the right. It's a way that reefs form naturally. And we put them out into sand flats because we actually found that patch reefs, so reefs that are kind of out in the middle of a sand desert, actually are the healthiest ones in the bay. And so they do quite well. And so I won't get into this whole design, but basically we're testing the arms approach, the arms seating approach, as well as how that approach performs against more traditional approaches to growing corals that are being used throughout the year. And so that was our big thing and what we jumped in to do. But what's really, I think, grown in sort of impact and importance over the last number of years has been to do with data collection and sort of how we're quantifying the system. So what I'm showing you here are the PhD students and postdocs involved in the project. We actually have even more than this now. But the key thing is if we wanted to know if we could successfully build a coral reef and then track it all the way through to say, does that lead to lower malnutrition in communities? We needed to be able to look at all of those linkages. And so to do this, we're collecting data from reef ecology, meaning what's the health of the natural reefs, what's the health of the artificial reefs, what's living on them, what's not, how many fish are there, how many are not. And then in the middle, looking at fisheries. So how many fish are being caught? Where are the fishers going? Where are they selling the fish or are they taking it home? What's the diversity of species? And even down to what's the nutrient composition of those fish. And then finally, looking at the human health side, looking at things like wasting and stunting, as I mentioned before, as metrics for malnutrition. Also, just looking at people's livelihoods, what they do to earn money, what they do to feed their family, and even taking it as far as tying it to mental health, right? Because mental health has been largely ignored in settings such as this, but is a really, really important piece. And so our PhD student, Hervet, here has performed one of the first mental health studies in all of Madagascar. And so we're really covering a lot of space and also really collecting some data that have never been collected before in this system. Um, we collected all of these data before we started, and then we will collect them again after and at additional intervals after to be able to see whether our intervention, that is the arm seating, actually has an impact. So for the next couple minutes, I'm just going to show you a bit of our exciting results, and then I'll kind of get into where we're going from here. And so we found some really exciting things with the arms and also with the natural reefs. So what you're seeing on the left are what we found in those test arms that I showed you before. What we're seeing on the right are what we find on natural reefs around the arms. And so in this case, the far left bar for the arms is the same site as the far left bar on the natural reefs. I've taken the key off because it's a bit confusing, but each color just represents a different type of organism. And I'm going to key you in on two. So in the arms, the brown is something called crustus coralline algae. It's sort of the pink purple stuff that you can sort of see on the healthy reef, like if you look in the picture bottom middle. Crustus coralline algae is really important for gluing the reef together, and it also is like flypaper for coral babies. So coral larvae like to settle on or near crustus coralline algae. So really, it's important both for sort of setting the stage and building the foundation for the reef, and also attracting good things for the reef like corals. And so it's really an important indicator. You can see here, each arms we had more than 50% coverage of CCA or crustus coralline algae, which is great because that looks like a young reef, a growing reef, and one that would attract corals. If we now move over to the graph on the right, what's happening around those arms, what we're seeing in the green is hard coral cover. So the good stuff. And so excitingly, we have these two sites that have very, very high coral cover. You see that the brown, the CCA, is actually very small. Your reaction might be, oh, that's concerning, but in fact, what we're seeing on the right is just more that the CCA is covered up by the corals. The corals are just taking up more space. And so that is what we'd expect to see in an older reef that has been around for longer. But one really encouraging thing we saw as well is that if you look at the site on the far left, you'll see, oh, the coral cover there is much lower, right? So that green bar, it's about 25%. Still, the arms from that site on the far left had CCA levels, the brown bar, just as high. And so what we're seeing is that we don't necessarily need to have the most pristine reefs in the world to seed the arms on. They just need to have some of those components of a healthy reef. And it seems we can get good seeding of the components, those ingredients that we need for a healthy reef to grow. And so that was really, really exciting to us and sort of told us we've been relatively successful with collecting these ingredients. So what about fish? So what we found were some really interesting things. So in the upper right, what we're looking at is what is being caught. And so the sizes are along the Y or the horizontal axis, and sort of the percentage of fish caught in those bins are on the Y on the vertical, and the X on the horizontal is the size classes. And really the big take home here is that people are catching extremely small fish. So 75% of the fish caught are less than 6 centimeters in length. But if you look down at the bottom at what is actually out there, similar idea. So now what we're seeing is not fish caught, but actually fish that are on the reef. And we're seeing that, yes, most of the fish are small, but there are some larger fish out there and they're not being caught. And so what we also found was that what people are using to catch fish really depends on the type of gear. And it really depends on if they're going out on a boat or they're just using the nets on the shoreline, like I showed you before. And so what we found, unfortunately, is that the largest amount of fish caught are when people are using nets and sort of dragging them along in shallows. And that is why we see such a skew towards small fish, because that's where the small fish are living. And so in some ways it's disheartening to see so many small fish going, but it's also encouraging to see that there are still some larger fish out there, because that suggests there's some fish large enough to be reproducing, creating more baby fish, which then should give the reefs a chance and allow them to grow. Okay, so now moving on to this final piece, sort of the third link of human health. And so going in, we knew that we would find that poverty and malnutrition are extremely high, but we didn't realize quite how bad it was or what really was occurring sort of at micro scales. So I mentioned it earlier. I was off by one number. The national average is 77% poverty, and we found that it was 91% in the Southwest. That study I mentioned a moment ago found that depression is very strongly linked to environmental change, and in particular, the drought and any sort of all the failures of agriculture, and really the inability to do agriculture is tied very tightly to environmental change and drought. And we found that most households, almost all, rely on the ocean for food and jobs, and they rely on it for daily wages and daily food, as opposed to, say, getting paid weekly or getting paid monthly. Um, but here on the far right, this table, I think, was really one of the more dramatic findings for us and really made us take a step back and sort of think about this whole system. So I mentioned to you before that stunting is a sign of chronic malnutrition in children under 5. And so that means for a long time, they haven't been getting enough food, and therefore they are much shorter than they should be for their age. And so we looked at the average of stunting, where you see in the overall column here, and it's 27%, higher than the national average, but about what we would have expected. But then when you separate that between the coastal villages and the inland villages, there were two inland villages and then the coastal villages, we see this very dramatic change. Coastal villages, 1 in 5 children are stunted, which already are extremely high levels that are very, very concerning. But all the more concerning, 2 out of 3 children in the inland communities were stunted. And really, we had no idea sort of the dramatic difference between the two and just how much more dire things were in the inland communities. And so, to bring this home, I think when I say inland, folks probably think a ways away from the coast. But in fact, inland in this case is the village of Ranobe, which somewhat ironic name given that it means big water, is about 5 miles or less from the coast. And so it is actually quite close to the coast. Um, Yet we have this dramatic difference. So what is different? So the coastal villages are primarily made up of Vezu people who are the traditional fishers, who have been there historically. And Rano Bay is made up of the Maskuru, who are the people who have been forced to the coast because of droughts inland, ruining agriculture. They're traditional herders, but they're now trying to transition into agriculture and into fishing. But what we're finding is that these communities are being much more severely impacted by food shortages. And when we talk to them and try to understand why that's the case, part of it has to do with lack of access to the coastline, even though they are so close. People don't have cars, so traveling there can be extremely difficult. And also because what agriculture they do carry out, they aren't able to get to the coastal markets because it's heavy. They grow cassava. And so they're forced to sell it to wholesalers for sort of pennies on the dollar, so to speak. Um, that cassava is then exported to other regions, and they get very little money for it. And so that really kind of told us yet another situation where the loss of reefs is really dramatically impacting this community. They already struggle to even get access to marine products, things along the coast. And then as those decline, it will get harder and harder for them. And they're already in this dire situation. But if we can open up those linkages better, if we can create better access, then we might be able to say, bring down the levels of stunting that we see in those communities. Okay, so I'll circle back to that in a moment, but first back to the reefs. Um, so I told you before that when the communities built the artificial reefs, part of the problem was that they were too small. And so to make them larger, we bought thousands of tons of locally quarried limestone. And so what you're seeing here on the far left behind my colleagues are essentially two of the spurs of the reef on land that are about to get moved into the ocean. And so each reef that we made are 4 of these spurs, and we're making 6 of these spurs, or 6 of these reefs, sorry. And so this also goes to show sort of the amount of human labor going into this effort. So one of the immediate benefits of this project is that everyone involved with building the reef is getting a day wage and getting paid more than they would from an alternative livelihood. And so it's infusing a lot of money into the bay. And I'm now going to be quiet and allow you to see this video of how it actually happens. Okay, so as you can see, a massive, massive undertaking. And I mentioned that people are being paid to build them, and you probably would also wonder, where did you choose to build them, and how did the communities feel about that? And one thing that I didn't mention that I meant to mention earlier was that when the original artificial reefs failed and when this new project, discussion of a new project started and we were able to get the funding, we met with each of the communities and went out with them to map out potential locations to put these reefs, got their input for them, and then held community votes as to where they should go. And so, in choosing the locations of these reefs, we as ecologists had certain depths we wanted them at, certain amount of water flow, certain water qualities, things like that. But we had to match those characteristics with the characteristics selected by the community, such as access to the reefs, distance traveled, all of those sorts of things. And so in the end, the location of the reefs were chosen by consensus with communities. And so in addition to the fact that the communities are being paid to do it, they also are essentially building the reef for their community as we move from south to north, moving up the coastline. We're engaging new communities, new groups of people to build the reefs that are sort of adjacent, most adjacent to their area. And so one of the really exciting things and one of the nice capacities of that's specific to Perry Institute for Marine Science is that we have developed something called Reef Shape as a way to do photomosaic. So taking thousands of images by a diver swimming over a reef and then stitching them together in the computer. So these are actual images of our artificial reefs. You can say that we're now putting the arms onto them. This is just sort of an example. The arms are actually much more dense. And then trying them against sort of traditional ways of outplanting corals by attaching them to domes, as I mentioned, in order to try to build the reefs. And so really the big thing now is to finish up building these reefs, collect the data, and then see if it has had an impact. And by impact, we mean, are we getting a functional reef? Are we growing more fish? Are people catching more fish? And is malnutrition decreasing? And I think answering that question will certainly take us a number of additional years of study. But I think we've laid the groundwork to figure that out. So I mentioned before the community decision. I wanted you to remember the community decision to build artificial reefs. And that's going to help you potentially to answer this question. So, what is the risk we took? And I'll give you a little more. What is the risk we took by choosing to build artificial reefs instead of alternative approaches? Any thoughts? Yeah, failure for the reef to grow. Absolutely. Huge investment. Absolutely true, Paul. Currents that could change potentially, not knowing the outcome, potentially affecting other ecosystems. Yes, absolutely. Yep. So absolutely, these are all really good thoughts. And they were all considerations that we had. But really, what it came down to for us was that um, we did, in fact, have local support, and that, in fact, this is what the communities decided. At the time they made the decision, and still really today, most Western scientists, which I would sort of bin myself in with, would probably have suggested that you should do a marine protected area, that you should close certain areas to fishing for some period of time to let them grow up. And then the fish will spill over and leave, and then you can catch them. or you can sort of rotate that around, close areas for a couple of years, let them grow up, open them, and let people fish. The problem with that is against the will of local communities, and sort of at the most basic point, these communities don't have that amount of time. Right. So we knew going in that poverty and malnutrition were extremely high. We didn't really realize how high it was. And so really we were faced with a situation where closing down fishing or sort of advocating for closing down fishing was just an untenable and really not a possible move. And so it was very eye-opening for me having worked there and first time working in this area of the world, just to understand the reality of sort of the choices we make in restoration and what that all means. And so in this case, we sort of went into it knowing these reefs may or may not be the solution. They may or may not work. Evidence suggests so far that they are working to some extent, or at least they're initially doing what we expect them to do. But really, we kind of felt that there wasn't much of a choice there. Our goal was to support the communities rather than to sort of force an approach or a tool or a way forward on them. And so that's what we did. It was sort of to empower that, but then also add in what we knew and what we had learned from these arms as a way to try to kind of enhance what they were already trying to do. And so that kind of leads to our next grant that's been approved, which is taking an even farther step back to say, look at this whole system, right? I told you the story about how malnutrition was extremely high in the village of Ranobe inland. And that has to do with transportation of goods, growing food, and a host of other issues. And so what we're going to be doing in the next iteration or sort of the next phase of the project is in addition to the reef work that we're doing, we're going to take it to the whole food system. And so looking at that, because we came to realize that if we don't have, there isn't a strong food system, there isn't a supported community, there isn't this constant chronic risk of human health and human life, then the reefs there will not be healthy. And really, we in this system and with this group are valuing the humans uh, here just as highly as the reefs and realizing that everything is extremely well connected. Even though we do tend to be people who are coming at least from a background of just focusing on the reefs. We've really realized that cannot be the way to go, and we need to think much more broadly. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you again, everyone, for being here, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Erin. So we'll just get straight into the questions. So the first one is from Paul. What material are the new arms made of?
Yeah, that's a great question. They are made from limestone. So limestone, of course, is rock, and that was quarried nearby, near to the communities. Limestone also happens to be the same material that coral skeletons are made out of, calcium carbonate. And so it's a really kind of the ideal material if you plan to be leaving these things out on the reef forever, which we do.
Okay, awesome. So next question is from Andrew. He's asking, how are these devices stabilized for storms? And are these systems directly applicable to spots that get weather?
Yes, that's a great question. So part of it, as I mentioned, is that part of why we did them as a pyramid is that that would add stability. But the even more significant thing that we did to add stability, as you saw that there's a rebar strut coming out of the top, we actually have a rebar strut going all the way through. And the reason for that is it's essentially a big nail. So we can use that to hammer it down into the substrate, which we do, and that is partially why. We knew we'd be putting in a high flow environment. We wanted to think about future storms. And so we knew that kind of giving it that anchor into the benthos or the seafloor would help to stabilize. Yeah, great question.
Okay, and also from Andrew, speaking to material ubiquity, hardness, and pollution, did you experiment with a glass bottle as substrate?
We haven't. I've thought about that in other systems though before, because it's often a material that's around and available and can have benefits. No, we haven't played around with glass yet though.
Okay. Next question is from Charlotte. How much does ocean acidification factor into your current restoration strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. OA, or ocean acidification, is definitely a concern. I would say it sort of trails in the level of concern relative to things like warming, causing bleaching, and what we call local impacts like overfishing or sedimentation. But OA, ocean acidification, is definitely a concern even now, while corals are not necessarily decalcifying. The more acidic the ocean is, or sort of the less basic the ocean is, the more energy it takes the coral to build its skeleton, less energy it has to fight things off, to grow, all of that. So OA is not something that we're sort of that's really on the forefront for us, but it's definitely a concern.
Okay, awesome. Next question is, how can students of marine science get involved with projects like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, I think reaching out to projects to see what types of internships they have available is often a good one to do. Perhaps even better is that if your school or community or an organization you find offers financial support for internships or for, say, travel internships, that's always a great one. If you're able to sort of secure some amount of support for a trip ahead of time, or if you want to apply to it, you found one that will buy a flight in 2 weeks somewhere, but you need to propose a project to them. You can reach out and say, hey, I'd like to apply for this grant to come work with you all. Will you help me with the application? And that being kind of like, help me with the context for writing. And most times, in my experience, people are more than happy to do that. And we do that all the time for students.
Awesome. Okay, before we move on to the next question, I just want to remind everybody about the participation feedback survey link. I just resent it in the chat. So if you all can complete it today, that would be great. So next question, how long do you leave the arms on healthy reefs before moving them to the artificial reef?
It's a great question. So the original plan was to leave them for at least 9 months and about a year. Because it was ended up being much more slow to build the reefs, they ended up staying there for about a year and a half to 2 years. That's fine, but I would prefer them to go sooner. And so my answer to that is we don't have real solid data on it from the system, but about 9 months to a year, I think, is a sweet spot. Beyond that, you get certain competitive dominance, say like a certain sponge can really start to dominate other things and actually decrease the biodiversity on it. So it's a little better to sort of catch it early when a bunch of things have settled on it and are creating space. But we don't really know. We have done tests of that in other systems, and we found that pattern that biodiversity increases and then decreases the longer you leave the arms there. Um, but overall, I think it's all good material to be starting the reef with. But to my mind, you want to be able to leave it there the shortest period of time possible. And for me, I think that's probably about 9 months.
Okay, awesome. Next question is from Bruce. Did you consider other ways and source local materials for the reef?
Yeah, so we did source local materials. So all that, those thousands of tons of limestone were definitely local materials. In terms of thinking about other things, we did. So we originally had some ideas for sort of adding some structures in addition to the limestone, on top of the limestone, more so than the arms and those stars with corals that you saw. But at the end of the day, we realized like that would just be introducing more metal, that would be introducing more cost, more technical things. And so we kind of scrapped it and just decided to go very, very simple. But yes, we did consider some other materials.
Thank you. Sithumi from Sri Lanka is asking, is it good to use metal structures as artificial reef structures?
Um, is it good? I think it's actually slightly better to avoid, but I don't think it's the end of the world. Metal structures are gonna, rust and things like that, and a lot of the what's often there of iron and certain other metals can stimulate the growth of bacteria that are somewhat harmful to corals, and it can be harder for corals to grow on. That being said, corals always surprise us and how where they can live, how resilient they can be, and so they can live on an incredible amount of different things. Um, and so I would say I wouldn't go into a project and say we want to make them out of metal, but if you already have metal in the ocean, then I would certainly be okay with, in my opinion, be okay with sort of continuing on with that.
Okay, thank you. And Paul is asking, after providing work and income temporarily, has there been any further work available to these families?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's one other piece that we have been looking at so far, has to do with aquaculture. And there is already some aquaculture done by the communities, and we've been working with them to see if that could be sort of increased. But what we're finding is that even people who do aquaculture still see themselves as fishers, right? They still, if you say, "What's your job?" They say, "I fish." And so aquaculture is really like a supplemental income, not an alternative income for them. And so beyond that, there really is not a whole lot. There's not a lot of industry there. There is a mining company that is starting up, which um, is something we're sort of aware of and could potentially lead to more jobs for the community. But really, it's difficult. There is some tourism in the area, but it's quite remote and quite rural. And COVID really hit tourism in the area pretty hard, and it hasn't really come back. And so that's kind of one of the big challenges is there just really isn't much alternative there.
Okay, understood. Paul is asking, sorry, Zion is asking, was there any risk of the quarry limestone polluting or contaminating the water?
Yeah, so certainly that was a consideration. We think that it's relatively benign because limestone is put into the ocean so often. That being said, we did very intentionally give it a few months um, to sort of cure, get things growing on it, release anything that might be harmful to the corals before we intentionally put anything on it. Because that's absolutely a consideration, is sort of anything you put on. And certainly probably one to consider with PVC. I mean, PVC is relatively inert, but it might still have materials associated with the fabrication process that come off. And so yeah, it's something, limestone felt as kind of naturally matched as possible and therefore not likely to contaminate, but that's definitely something to always think about.
Okay. Mark is asking, are there other areas using the pyramid arms?
Not that we know of. We we work with some folks in some other places using arms, but for the most part, they've been still doing the square. Some have switched over to limestone as well, and putting sort of bigger gaps in between the plates and things like that. Um, excuse me, but the pyramid model, I've only ever known about us doing. Others might do it, but we're not sure. We have been sort of talking about at some point in the future running an experiment comparing our structure shape to traditional ones and to other ones, just to see if we get different organisms living on them. And so that's something I'd love to do in the future because that also can help us link back to other studies that are using traditional arms.
All right, thank you for that. Next question is from Sarah. Will you be attending the International Coral Reef Symposium next summer? There will be a specific arm.
Ah, I didn't realize that. In all likelihood, I probably will. I am a co-chair of a session looking at sort of restoration technology for future reefs. I didn't know that there was an arms session as well, though, so perhaps I ought to look at that and maybe apply to that, and certainly have colleagues of mine apply to that as well. Thanks for the heads up, Sarah.
See, we're just networking at this webinar. Okay,
Yep,
so
there you go.
next question is from Ariane. I'm not sure if you already answered this regarding the quarried limestone, but has sedimentation posed any challenges?
It's one of our biggest. Yeah. Sedimentation is huge in this system, sort of wherever you are. I am blown away at how well the corals tolerate sediment. It's pretty wild, actually. Um, but yes, sedimentation is definitely an issue. And so we've been sort of thinking about that in terms of where we're putting the arms on the reefs, where we're putting the stars on the reefs, but also thinking about down the road whether we want to do some what we'd call invertebrate seeding, meaning putting herbivores that live on the reef onto the reefs as a way to sort of clean things up in the same way that the fish normally would. We ran some test studies with hermit crabs. It was one of the cutest experiments ever. And the hermit crabs did an extremely good job of cleaning off the rocks, both of the algae, but in cleaning the algae and consuming the algae, they also essentially dust off the sediment. So you get really clean rocks back from that. So yes, that's a really big one. One cool thing though to point out is that, as I mentioned before, we don't have a lot of bleaching. And that's in part because the corals there aren't exposed to super warm water all that frequently, but they are to some extent. And they still don't tend to bleach. And so it kind of led us this question of why. And the thing is that bleaching requires both warm temperatures and a lot of light. And so if you decrease light, corals can tolerate warmer temperatures a little bit better. All of the sediment in the water, the sedimentation, actually decreases the amount of light reaching the corals. And so we actually think all the sediment in the water, which we call the term turbidity, actually might be helping the corals because it's giving them a little bit of a natural shading in those times where it gets really warm. We haven't tested that yet, but that's sort of one hypothesis we have for why in the world the corals in this one spot really just don't show very much bleaching at all.
Ah, okay. Awesome. So next question is from Mohammed. How can the arm system be applied to substrate conditions that are ravine-like or sloped?
Good question. Don't have a great answer. I think the traditional arms, I think, would really struggle. I mean, they have an anchoring system, but it doesn't go very deep. I think maybe the fact that we're using a long piece of rebar that we could theoretically drive a couple of feet down into the substrate might help. But all in all, I would be, even with that, I would still be concerned on downslopes about what might end up happening. But I do actually think if you can drive a rebar strut down through there, they'll be more stable than alternatives, say like stars or coral tables or things like that, if you are talking about a slope. But yeah, that's a good question. Something we've been talking about and looking at too, right? Because you can see that our artificial reefs are shaped like this. So up here it's relatively flat. On the sides, we really do get that slope. We have been able to find that if you kind of stake them in on the sides, they seem to do okay, whereas some of the stars will fall over in a storm. But I would certainly want to test that in any system I was thinking about putting them on some sort of steep slope because I would be concerned about them getting ripped out.
Mm, okay. Next question might be the final question. So, participants, if you have any more questions, now is the time to probably add them to the chat or the Q&A section. Velavan asks, what are the biggest challenges in scaling this toolkit to be accessible for more communities globally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, so some of the sort of groundwork we've laid for this for use globally is this idea of using limestone in particular, but also just kind of any cheap and locally sourceable material. What we've been finding really, like I said, is that our arms are functioning well, and we both revise the material we use, made them a new shape. And so what I think that tells me is that you can work off that theme, but you don't need to create exactly the type of arms we did, exactly the same material, exactly the same shape. They can be sort of locally adapted. And then in terms of building the reefs themselves, I think things thinking about, say, are you going to try to extend onto a reef that exists? Are you going to be working on a degraded reef that's already hard substrate? Are big questions, or do you want to try to create a whole new reef in a whole new area? One of the things we are going to be producing out of this, we've started already, is sort of like what you say, like a toolkit, but really a description of how we did all this and what design considerations and what questions we asked ourselves. And so we will make that available and make that available in many different languages so that we can put that out there because you've kind of hit the nail on the head here that that is one of our big goals. It's not just for the Bay of Ranobe, Southwest Madagascar. It's just that this was a particularly useful place to test this question.
Alrighty, awesome. I think that is the last of our questions for today. Don't
I see
seem to
one
see.
just at the end from Ariana. Heard the sea cucumber farming is big. Sea cucumber farming is very big in the region we are. And so when I mentioned aquaculture, that's one of the pieces of it. Sea cucumber farming and seaweed farming. And so what we're doing though is both of those are exports. And so when we're thinking about aquaculture and talking with communities, we're also thinking about what they might be interested in farming in the ocean that could be both sold but also consumed at home. So it's not entirely dependent on exporting and getting money from that. But yes, absolutely, sea cucumber farming is a big thing in Madagascar.
Alrighty, awesome. I think if we can probably open up the floor maybe for a minute or two, if anyone wants to ask any questions, um, yourself, you can raise your hand and we can allow you to speak. But that looks like it was all the written questions. So if we don't have any hands, yeah, I think you did a great job, Dr. Hartman, answering all the questions.
Great.
Oh
Thanks,
wait, I
Sarah.
think we do have a hand. Sorry. Okay, one second. Hala. Okay. Hala, you're able to speak? Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, I'm asking to unmute. Okay, not sure. I think the hand went down.
Okay, I saw
Um,
though that they also put the question in the chat. I can just read it. How can the restoration techniques covered be adapted for regions with high microplastic pollution or unique environmental stressors such as those found in the Gulf of Oman? That's a great question. Part of it is that when we see the arms, we're picking healthy reefs. We're picking healthy reefs that are not far from the new reef that we're trying to build. And so that in and of itself, the fact that we're collecting organisms from that area, from what make up a healthy reef, is a really important way we get at this sort of like site specificity or things that are specific to your environmental stress or pollution, right? Because the organisms living on that healthy reef in your region are tolerating the unique environmental stressors, are tolerating um, potentially microplastics, assuming they're found on that healthy reef. So that's kind of one piece of it. I think also too, thinking about kind of like the substrate material that you're going to be using, what you're putting it on. For us, we're putting it on sand, but we do also think about like what is the grain size? How big is each piece of sand? Or is it just going to sink into the muck, or is it going to actually stay on top? So that's a really important one as well. Um, and so, yeah, I really think it's kind of like looking at what reefs are healthy in your region and say, like, how can we sort of recreate that? What are the reasons why this is a healthy reef, and how can we use the arms and building good reefs in order to kind of recreate that same reef system in a different place.
Alrighty, awesome. Andrew is asking, would you be able to go into vert invert use of the pyramids? Like, is there a top to bottom through hole internally? And quickly and briefly, if one was doing a restoration of a wreck or grounding site, for example, would this be a recommended or target device? Sorry.
Yeah, those are great questions. So we haven't, so in terms of thinking about what things are living and where. What we tend to see is that a lot of the encrusting invertebrates live on the undersides. So we always look at the top of the plate and then the bottom of the plate. Bottom of the plate will be like covered in sponges and ascidians and tunicates and things like that. And so that tells us that they really like dark and they really like kind of overhangs. So we really see a lot of that there. Fewer things living on the top sides of it. But things like CCA, we see a lot of on the top side and in the light. So we do see some of that. And on the bottom, there's a lot more sand scour. So it tends to be the hardiest critters. And a lot more of the motile stuff will tend to be higher up in it. But we have some data from that on like traditional arms made from PVC from the Indo-Pacific, but we don't really have much specific data yet for this project. Um, and yes, there's a top to bottom through hole internally. So each of those plates is drilled. The gap we have between them is four different plugs on the corners to keep them separated. And I think a wreck or a grounding site would be a cool place to do it, just because you're able to bring so many organisms in, and they're already on their home, right? They're already on the arms unit, and then you can adapt it, figure out where you can attach it to that wreck site as best you possibly can, as a way to then try to seed it.
Alrighty. Mark says his group intends to have an underwater resort slash research center in the Bahamas, and he believes a partnership with your organization is a must. How can he get in touch with your group?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. We can certainly put my email address in the chat. I can do that right now. Um, and I can connect you with the folks. I feel like I've heard of this, but I don't know much about it. So I am not the best person um, to answer, but feel free to email me and I would be happy to connect you. Thanks for bringing that up.
I'm not sure if you see Andrew's comment. He says they're doing a rec in Move now, and feel free to get in touch with him.
Cool. Okay, I snagged the number, Andrew.
Awesome. Alrighty, everyone. Any more questions for Dr. Hartman? Fab and groovy.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Alrighty.
This was fun, and thank you, Danielle, for hosting us here.
No problem. And thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today to learn more about the topic taking risks to restore reefs, community seeding with arms in Madagascar. So thank you to Dr. Hartman for this very informative presentation. So for more information, please visit our website at perryinstitute.org. Follow us on all of our social media channels at Perry Institute for Marine Science, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as TikTok, which we have now. We hope you will join us again in the future for our future webinars. So with that being said, thank you everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care.